Well, welcome back, everyone. So this lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about fieldwork and methods in anthropology, which aligns with the chapter that you guys are reading this week in your book. And I want to talk about some of the different things that anthropologists do, how we go about studying things, how we go about gathering data, but also the perspective that we have on that data. And so I'll check in a few times and say, like, the perspective that we need to maintain. The book does a good job cataloging some of the things that we do. I'm going to go over some of that information, talk about some different information, things like that. Some of it's pretty straightforward and I don't need to. Others I kind of want to draw out some of the information a little bit more closely, okay? One of the first things that I want to talk about is that with cultural anthropology, there is what is sometimes referred to as the Messiah complex, which is a little bit older of a term. You don't hear it as much anymore. But the Messiah complex refers to the fact that within anthropology, for a long time, there was sort of greater prestige and greater cachet that was placed on studying people that were more foreign, more exotic, more different, more the other, that term that we so often use to discuss cultures that are so very dissimilar from our own. And that wasn't a good thing. It wasn't a healthy thing. It did not sort of maintain the anthropological perspective that we should. But in the early part of the 20th century and into the mid part, you still had this idea that somehow your field work and your research was more valuable if you were studying people very, very different than you, very foreign, very exotic, very all of that, like I said. And this term, the Maasai complex, comes from the Maasai, who are a cultural group that is located in East Africa. They're a part of what used to be called the East Africa Cattle Complex, a number of fairly interrelated cultures that had a lot of similarities. They are pastoralists, which means that they herd cattle. They're nomadic or semi-nomadic as they move their herds around to different areas and parts of the grasslands to feed and stuff like that. But it included like the Datog, the Barba Ag, the Maasai, a bunch of different cultural groups in Kenya and Tanzania and other modern nation states that they, of course, did not, have. Those were impositions of British, German, and Dutch colonial rule in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. But the Maasai were one of the first kind of cultural groups that fascinated Europeans because they were so quote unquote different. The Maasai, as this picture here is, the Maasai are very, very tall, they're very, very lean, and they are a warrior culture. The men often wear red, as you see here. They use red ochre as paint on their bodies. They rub it into their hair and things like that. And everywhere that a man would go traditionally, he would carry this spear that you see there with him. And in order to become a man, you were expected to either kill another man, or a lion with that spear. Okay, this is a very tough, very aggressive kind of culture. We'll talk about why that might be when we talk about subsistence and how you kind of make a living off the landscape as a forager people, or excuse me, as a pastoral people, as a pastoral people that are always moving around, which means that you're always kind of bumping up against other groups and things like that. That can be very problematic. My mentor, Stuart McRae, actually lived with the Maasai. So this is very much something that he kind of had, and he admitted, and the truth is it's something that we've overcome, at least in part in recent years. There's still prestige that's sort of like you lived in some really remote, tough situation. But the reality is you do not need to go to the developing world in order to do really important anthropological research. I would argue some of the most important research that we've done in recent years has been in the developed world to talk about, say, minority groups or groups that are marginalized or disenfranchised, be it immigrants or lower castes in some modern nation states like, say, India, or undocumented workers in the U.S., or the health disparity for African Americans or Native Americans here, or that Europeans are doing to talk about, the immigrant experience from Syria and things like that, European anthropologists and stuff. And so The truth is, some of our best work, I would argue, has been happening in our own backyard of late. My girlfriend, who has a PhD in cultural anthropology, while she's from India, she came to the US to study and ultimately decided to do her research here in the US and ended up looking at the rise of the alt-right and white nationalism and the kind of reemergence of white supremacy in the last several years in the political landscape. And it's extremely important work. It's important work that talks about how these networks are built, how people are radicalized and recruited. People like, Dylan Roof and others that have committed these terrible acts of domestic terrorism. That's really important work. And to talk about that social landscape is a good thing. And so while we still do probably spend more time out of the country than within the country, we have increasingly recognized that was kind of an outmoded way of thinking, right? So one of the other things that I want to mention here is what's called culture shock. When you are living and working with a people that you are not familiar with, when you are in a culture that is not your own, you will experience what's called culture shock, which is this sense of disorientation and uncomfortableness and these kinds of things that come with it. And it happens to literally all of us. I have done field work in Central America, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, in the United States, been all over the world, and the truth is that it still happens. It still happens to me. That there comes a day when you are so tired of trying to constantly translate things in your head. It's so exhausting. Some of you know, to think in a language that isn't your native language, to be constantly, trying to ask questions and get people to talk to you and figure out what you're supposed to do and what's the right custom here and what's the right, behavior and what are manners and what's okay and what's not. And to put it bluntly, also, a lot of times if you're a foreigner in the developing area, having people constantly asking you for money or a job or a green card or marry my sister or, these kinds of things. It's tiring. It's really tiring, right? And there are times when you just are so overwhelmed by it all that you just kind of shut down. And that's okay. That happens to the best of us, right? As I said. And it's an interesting thing. It's a hard thing to cope with, especially for us as anthropologists who are trained to value culture, to spend time with people. It can feel very disconcerting, but that's okay. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It just means that you and I are raised with these basic expectations about how the world works, and then suddenly, those don't work anymore, right? So it's a strange kind of a thing, Continuing on here, right? One of the things that I want to point out is the most important consideration when it comes to our fieldwork. The thing that must be more important than anything else that we do, talk about, or study. It's not our method. It's not our theoretical framework. It's not the quality of the journals that we publish in. The most important consideration is the people that we work with, their safety, their well-being, their comfort. We are not working with lab mice. We are not working with chemicals in a laboratory. We are working with people. We're working with human beings. And if our work is going to cause harm to people in any way, then it shouldn't be done. Period. End of story. That's it. Right? We must always consider the local peoples that we live with and what it is going to do to them. There have been times when this has, really interrupted some field work. There was a kind of noted anthropologist that was working down in Guatemala decades ago when they had the Civil War. And they had a really bad problem with like the guerrillas and stuff. And he was going every summer. He had spent years going down there every summer. And he started coming down and going, well, where is so-and-so that I was working with last year that was working as his guide and his translator and stuff? And they said, oh, well, he's gone. And then the next summer, the same thing happened. And the next summer, the same thing happened. And what he realized finally was basically that the guerrillas, because this guy was talking to an American, was assumed that he was working with the CIA. And so they were killing his translators when he left town. And so he stopped going down there. He said, I won't. He'd been doing research there for decades. And he said, I'm not going back to Guatemala because I can't put people in danger by talking to me. It's the most important thing that we can think of, are people going to be emotionally, psychologically, financially impacted by working with us? They have to come first. at all times, right? And so we have a lot of protocols in place to make sure that that remains the same. Some years ago, there was an anthropologist too that was working in China, and he was one of the first people that actually, this was in the 80s, and so it was during China's one-child policy, and he was one of the first people. He wrote an article about the forced abortions that were happening because they had the one-child policy. If you already had a kid and you got pregnant again, then the state would force you to have an abortion. And he was very religious, which is fine. And he decided to write an article, I think it was the Washington Post, I can't remember, about this and talk about how China was forcing this because he personally was very anti-abortion. That's all fine. However, he did not conceal who these people were that were telling him this, that he did not conceal their identities. He did not do a good enough job concealing what village he was working in. And many of these people were arrested and they were put into quote unquote re-education camps because of it. He was a PhD student at the time and his university threw him out because he put people in harm's way because of his personal opinion. And if you cannot remove yourself from that and understand that the safety of our informants is most important, then you should not be doing this. They must come first at all times. And so this also gets into a perspective here. As I mentioned before, we don't, this isn't lab rats, this isn't chemicals, this isn't cells, right? These are living, breathing human beings, just like me, just like you. They have hopes and dreams and fears, they have kids, they have communities, they have loved ones. And it's important to remember, we don't say, oh, well, I don't, I study those people. That's not what we say. I study with those people. Because nothing I do is going to be accomplished if these individuals, if these people do not help me. And if I cannot recognize their humanity, I shouldn't be doing this, right? We study with those people. I didn't study Swazis, I studied with Swazis. And everything that I learned about wild plants, about shamanism, about Sangomas and their ritual practices, everything that I learned about the Yachaks, the shamans in the Amazon jungle, and everything that I learned about their relationship to the jaguar spirits and their use of ayahuasca and all the rest of this, everything I learned was because they were kind enough to take the time to explain it to me. I'm not studying those people, I'm studying with those people. They already know this stuff. And they're taking the time to patiently explain it to some idiot outsider who doesn't know. So I'm not studying them, I'm studying with them. They are partners. They're collaborators. This is not, we need to make sure that this is not a kind of neo-colonialism, okay? So going to the field, right? What do we do, right? Choosing a field site can be kind of tough. It's one of the big things I think that students ask is how do you know where to go, right? I mean, you're an anthropologist, you can go anywhere in the world, right? It's going to be based on a number of factors, but the biggest one is going to be the questions that you're asking. So, for example, if I have in the past studied things like the use of wild plants or the use of wild resources and foraging behavior, then I'm not going to be studying in most of North America. I'm not going to be studying in Europe. I'm not going to be studying most places in Central America. A few places, certainly, right? There's only some cultures and groups where people are still out there gathering wild plants, wild animals, shellfish, whatever, for food, for medicine, for construction materials, to sell, whatever it is, right? There's only so many places that I'm going to go in the world then, right? You find these things more in the developing world, which is why I've worked in the Amazon. It's why I worked in southern Mexico. It's why I worked in Swaziland. It's why I've, traveled in some of these other places, right, where I maybe didn't do a lot of work, but traveled and sort of got to experience these things. At other times, depending on what you're studying, it may be impossible for you to go into the developing world. There's nothing there for you to explore if you're going to talk about, say, the rise of fascism, or the reemergence of nationalistic ideologies. You're going to be in a modern nation state, right? You're going to be in a one of these cultural groups, right? So your questions determine where you go. what is it that you're interested in? Are you interested in tourism and development? Are you interested in conservation policy? Are you interested in maternal mortality? Are you interested in exposure to toxins? What are you interested in? What do you want to know about, right? What is it that your questions are, and so that's going to help determine it. Once you kind of know what you're interested in, oftentimes for us, what we do is when you go to grad school, you're going to find a mentor, and you're going to pick that mentor before you even apply and say, hey, I want to work with you on this thing. And they're going to help you get those introductions in the field, or they're going to point you to new field locations and things like that. It all depends there, right? Typically, traditionally, we in the U.S., we did 1 year field work for our PhD. The MA was usually shorter, 2-3 months. Today, less and less do you see the entire year. A lot of this came back to in the early 1900s when it was sort of like, oh, you should live with them for a full calendar year so you could see like all of the agricultural cycle and stuff like that. That's really not as necessary today as it used to be. We know what life is like in, say, Mexico, right? There's literally thousands of books written about Mexican culture, Mexican life, or about Kenyans, or about, I don't know, farmers in China or whatever, and so you don't have to live there for that long. And so it's kind of become a little bit shorter, though it's still pretty traditional to do that. Language skills can be very important, but it's become more and more common to use translators. I certainly have at times, and at times not. Language skills still are important, though, just to build rapport with the people, right? As I said, your research topic is your primary thing, right? Because you can go anywhere in the world, right? You can pick any place. How we go about funding this is usually through grants, is that we write research proposals that we'll submit to various funding agencies, and they will assess the merit of what we want to study and whether or not that's worthy of it. And then they will pay for us to go there, which is, a lot of people think maybe, oh, you got a grant, you're rich. It really isn't. You're not allowed to spend grants on anything except your research. And the truth is, especially for somebody like me working in the developing world, it's really cheap. I mean, the most expensive thing is a plane ticket of, $1,000, $1,500, maybe more depending on where you're going. And then, food and lodging in a lot of these places might run you $5 or $10 a day, right? And so grants aren't quite what people think they are a lot of times, And as I said, fieldwork is changing, right? We used to go to like sort of a village and live there. Like it was single-sided. You went to one place. You studied sort of everything about the culture and their rituals and their songs and their dances and their cooking and their food and their farming practices and, their funeral rites and just everything about them, right? It was a very comprehensive examination. As I say, it was a study of a culture. I'm saying this one culture. Today, so many people have been documented, it's just not necessary anymore, right? We know what kind of crops are grown in Papua New Guinea, right? It's okay. We don't need to document that. Today, it's more multi-sided, so we are looking at different groups in different places. We're saying one group in several different places. And so what is the experience, say, for Syrian refugees in France versus Syrian refugees in the UK versus Syrian refugees in the US? Maybe that, right? Or similar things, right? So we're looking at different groups. When I was in Swaziland, I looked at 3 different villages, Shuula, Mapavene, and Tontupego. And those 3 villages were sort of on a gradation from like urban to extremely rural. And I interviewed people there to see what their relative knowledge of wild plants were, like how many wild plants could they name, how many uses for wild plants did they have, how often did they use wild plants for food and for medicine, for home construction, for firewood, for those kinds of things, to see is there a difference between these groups. So I was multi-sided, right? And not surprisingly, there was a huge difference, right? It's much more focused. We're much more focused on a topic, one thing, right? As I was saying in that study about like how does your sort of gradation of urban versus rural impact your knowledge about these things. I'm not studying all this other stuff around about their culture, right? And so it's very focused, very specific, and it's the study of culture, not a culture, right? It's a study of a cultural feature, right? And again, there's still a lot of crossover and things like that, but it's acknowledging a 21st century need in research as we become transglobal and transnational, and borders become less meaningful as we move around more and that kind of stuff. And so our study of humans is going to be reflective in this very changing behavior of humans. Sorry, I think we had a little video freeze there. As I said, ethics are paramount. That you need to make sure that you have informed consent, which means that people understand what you're studying. They understand that you will be publishing about this, you will be talking about this. You are invading their private lives, and so ethics is really critical. This is why we have what's called an IRB, the Institutional Review Board. Anytime we do a study, we must get permission from the IRB. Right? This can take anywhere from a few weeks, as it has for me, to a year, as it has for other friends of mine, depending on the sensitivity of what it is that you are looking at, right? And so, for example, a good friend of mine did her master's degree on female sexual addiction, and people who had entered into sort of rehab programs because of sexual addiction. This had ruined their lives. It had cost them their careers and their jobs and their families and, things like that. That's a very sensitive topic. It took her almost a year to convince the IRB, like, these are the questions I'm going to ask. This is how I'm going to meet them. This is what we're going to talk about. This is how I'm going to protect their identity, all of these kinds of things. At the same time she was doing that, I went to Mexico to do interviews with tourists about why they chose to go to Mexico, why they feel safe there, did they feel safe there, those kinds of things. And I was interviewing basically Americans, tourists, and they went, oh, yeah, that's fine, go ahead. I got it was like 3 weeks, and they said, go knock yourself out, right? So it all depends, But it is critically important that we do this, that we make sure that we are letting people know what we're talking about and how we're going to approach it. We don't trick people. We don't pretend to be something that we're not. That is completely unethical. And it's very important that we help our research partners in the field know what we're doing and why. Okay. So some of the ways that we gather data, they talk about this in your book, right? They kind of phrase it a little bit strange on some of this. Qualitative and quantitative data. The best research, in my opinion, is both. What's often called mixed methods, right? Qualitative and quantitative data are really critical. Quantitative data is data that is numeric, basically. You can count it. You can apply a statistical analysis to it. Qualitative data is not. And so what do people think about the environment? How do people feel about politics in America right now? That's not exactly something you count. You have to describe that. What's often called thick description. It requires a little bit more verbiage than just being able to say X% of people eat organic or whatever, right? Well, why do they eat organic? What do they think about organic food? What is it that's appealing about organic food? That's something that requires a little, something else. The best anthropology, in my opinion, I think the opinion of many of us, is that it is going to be both, right? And so it's interviews and it's questionnaires. It's talking to people and getting those survey numbers down, right? And this is why rapport building is so important to us, right? To get people to talk to you, to get people to spend time with you, to get people to open up about their lives, potentially things that are really, really sensitive. You need to build rapport. You need to talk to folks, right? That is, at the end of the day, a big part of what anthropology, cultural anthropology, is all about. Is just taking the time to talk to people and get to know them. Reserving judgment, understand things from their perspective, why these things matter to them, right? And we often call these individuals that we build rapport with informants. And it's not the best word in the world, but I can't really think of a better word for it, and we haven't come up with one. Some anthropologists don't like it, although it's still the most common thing around, as it is in your book, is that you have these people that help you understand the culture, right? And informant sounds like something shady's going on, like we work for the FBI, and that's just not the case, but it's just the best way we have to describe these things, You'll often have a key informant somebody that you can really go to and say, look, I don't understand this, or I don't know about this, or this came up and what does that mean? In a few weeks, we'll probably be watching a documentary about a very famous anthropologist named Napoleon Chagnon, and we'll see some examples of all the things that we're talking about here, and I'll point those out to you as well. But you'll often have somebody that it's just you're a little bit closer to, that you can go to and say, like, hey, maybe I have something sensitive that I want to ask about whatever. When I was working in Mexico, for example, I didn't bring it up because at the time, especially, it was really at the height of the cartel war, and everybody go, oh, well, there's none of that in Oaxaca. There's none of that in Oaxaca. And finally, I had someone that I was close enough to go and go, listen, I know it's not public, but is there any of that? And he was like, oh, hell yeah, all over the place, right? And when I was in Swaziland, it was having people that I was close enough to say, listen, I know that poaching is illegal and I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble, but how much poaching actually goes on? For them to go, quite a bit, and so someone that you can really kind of learn some of the ins and outs about the culture and maybe some of the things that are considered taboo to discuss is something that's really important. And so it's very important to stay open to that and to keep that sort of going, And the last thing that I want to talk about is emic and etic perspectives, right? Whenever we're getting this kind of qualitative data, there's different perspectives that this data comes from, right? The perspective of the insider and the outsider. And it talks about this in your book, but I wanted to make sure that it was understood, right? We'll talk about it a little bit more when we talk about language after this. But this comes down to different ways of kind of viewing the world. And one of the big mistakes that people make is to try to figure out who's right, okay? And so, for example, why don't Hindus eat cows? Is it their perspective that they don't eat cows because they're sacred? Or is it some outside, scholars like Marvin Harris who have said that, oh, they don't eat them because they're more economically valuable alive, right? A lot of people get worked up trying to figure out who's right, quote unquote. One of the most important perspectives, and I just realized that I misspelled perspective in this slide. One of the most important perspectives that an anthropologist can maintain is an understanding that this is just different ways of viewing the world. It's not about right and wrong, okay? Instead, it's about appreciating what that means for that person, right? And how that shapes them. As we often say, like, there's a very famous example in Central Africa, I think it's among the Tiv culture, that say that the earth is resting on and I always get the order mixed up, earth is resting on the back of like a elephant, which is standing on the back of a giraffe, which is standing on the back of like a rhinoceros, which is standing on the back of like a hippo, and all of it is standing on the back of a turtle, right? And I think it was Paul Bohannon quite famously asked, like, what's the turtle standing on? The guy finally got irritated and goes, look, it's just turtles all the way down after that, right? Well, listen, from a scientific standpoint, is the Earth sitting on the back of a turtle? No, we have, spacecraft and satellites and things like that. We can see that. But the interesting question is not who's right. The interesting question is not, why do they not know that? The interesting question is, how does that shape them into a different human being than it does me, who believes that it's sitting in space, right? And that there's a gravitational well and there's all of this other kind of stuff. How does that shape them different? How does that represent a different relationship to animals or to the natural environment or to the things around them? Those are the interesting questions. And so having an emic and an etic perspective is not about determining who is right and who is wrong, but rather coming at an understanding of how these perspectives have shaped us so differently, and alter our relationship with ourselves, with our universe, with our community, with our whatever. Okay. And so, as I said, the book kind of explains those well, but I did want to sort of draw that out. Okay. Thank you guys very much.